Hi there, welcome to Floating in Books. Today's video is going to be my language learning tips if you want to improve your fluency. Welcome to everybody watching today. Thank you so very much for joining me. This video is a little bit differently from what I normally do on the channel, but if you know anything about me, you know that my day job is to be a teacher, an English teacher to be precise. I have been teaching English for over 15 years. I think it's been 16 by now. I've lost count. So yeah, I did a video a couple of months ago where I shared my tips how reading can improve your language, and that seems to be going down quite well. So I figured, why not do another one, but this time focus on fluency and speaking. And the reason why I wanted to do this follow-up video is because there was some confusion I felt when I saw some of the comments where people were like, oh, but language so-and-so is like really difficult to learn when you're reading. I was like, but the point of the video was to tell you how reading can help you to learn a language. So then why do you leave that comment? So I was like, there are other aspects to learning a language. And sure, there are languages that have never been written down, so how are you ever going to read them? However, if you have a language which has been written down, then reading can be a strategy that you can use to improve your knowledge of vocabulary, and it's something you can very easily do at your own pace as well. And that's why I feel it's a very safe way for people to get started with learning a language if that's what you want to do. Also, reading is incredibly helpful if you want to know more words, want to increase your register, doing all those kind of things. So even if it's perhaps not the starting point for most people, it can definitely be useful within a language learning journey to sort of improve, become better, get yourself to go to a higher level, etc., etc. So reading can be a really helpful tool, but it's just one of many, and that's what that video focused on, which is why I thought it could be helpful to come on here to tell you about some of my tips if you're just looking to improve fluency and speaking, having conversations with people, that sort of thing. I do want to excuse the makeup look. I'm testing out new products for my other channel, so I've got two different blushes and highlights on. So if that's throwing you off, I do apologize, but I hope it doesn't take away from this video at all. So first things first, I think the best way to improve your fluency, if that's your aim, if you want to become a better speaker, the top tip always has been is to interact with the community that speaks the language you want to speak. If that's travel, that's even better yet. The best way to improve any language is to immerse yourself within the community, to go there and to interact with people. That's the best way to really get a feel for the language, how things sound, how things are being used in everyday language. And that's, of course, something that is going to also, like, if you truly immerse yourself and you're trying to get yourself to interact with people who don't speak any other languages, save for the language you're trying to learn, you're gonna have to make do with whatever language knowledge you already have to try and make yourself understood, and that can be incredibly helpful for how to improve your fluency. It's the quickest way, it's definitely the best way, but it's also a very inaccessible way because not everybody has the means to travel to places. Maybe the language you're trying to learn isn't exactly spoken by a lot of people as well, so that can be challenging. But I definitely feel that it is the best way. The best way to improve your fluency is to put yourself out there and interact in the language you're trying to speak. There are a lot of challenges that goes with it, not just the traveling aspect to it. I know from people who I used to teach Dutch to, expats mainly, that they struggled learning Dutch in the Netherlands because Dutch people are so eager to speak English that the minute they detect a like a foreign accent, they're like, our brains are like hardwired to just default to English straight away. And that's not helpful for people who are trying to learn Dutch. So then you need to be very conscious. Like, it's okay if you go to a place and you're trying to learn the language, to ask people to slow down, to repeat something, or in the case of many of my students that I used to teach, to ask people to speak the language with you. So if you're in a shop and you're asking a question in a language and you've really tried hard to make that sentence in your brain, and someone replies in a language that isn't the language you're trying to speak, you need to try and ask them like, hey, I'm practicing. Could you make the effort of speaking this with me? Of course, don't do it when you have 10 people in line waiting behind you. But if it's like a quiet day and you're looking for something, then definitely do that. I myself, I'm not super proficient in languages other than Dutch and English, but I speak a little bit of German and I speak a little bit of French. So whenever I do travel to Germany or France, I try to make an effort to at least start a conversation in that language. And then try and see how I go along. In German, I'm a bit more successful than I am in French. So for instance, when I traveled most recently, I vlogged it as well. I went to Düsseldorf and I encountered a lady in a shop who didn't speak any English. Very often I will ask if they speak any English, and sometimes I just try to keep the ball rolling. But yeah, I bought a pair of sandals in like the best German I can possibly muster. And it's just a great way for me to, again, practice and know more things. And the thing I run into with German is that I don't have the vocabulary. Like, I can build sentences because it's very similar to Dutch, so I can pretty much copy Dutch sentence structure and use it in German. I mean, it's pretty easy. But it's the words that, like, I just can't think of things. And then my brain is, like, in foreign language mode, which for me is English. So then I come up with a bunch of words in English, whereas it would be easier if I'm trying to speak German to try and stick to Dutch, because there's a lot more in common there than between German and French, but German and English, I should say. And with French, it's actually even worse. Like, I can do like a basic conversation in French, because that's what I learned in school when I was a teenager. So some of that's still in here, but I can't really go past like standard phrases. And when someone speaks to me in rapid French, I can never understand them. Like with German, I can pretty much still understand people if they speak German to me, but I can't speak back. But with French, I feel I have even less knowledge. I try to always like start the conversation in French and then ask people if they can help me in English, and if not, if they can like get their coworker or something. But what happens to me now that I've been to Paris a few times is that on the train home, like my brain starts to all of a sudden be hardwired for French, and I can like do an entire conversation. So it's like within the moment, and I think that that's the biggest challenge whenever you're trying to practice your fluency, is that you have to be very much like on the tips of your toes. Like it's very much like go, go, go. And I think that's the main challenge with fluency, especially if you're in a real life situation with a native speaker, especially who's used to like going a million miles an hour. It can be very difficult to get them to slow down and to do things. So very often you can actually find this online as well. There are tools that allow you to interact with people like live face-to-face settings, where you can have a conversation with people who are like trying to help you to learn the language. I think it's called I'm not sure if they're still around. I haven't looked into this for a while, but there are like some things that will have you do that. So fluency wise and like interacting in a conversation is one of the most difficult things to do in a language that isn't your own, you could say. So really having that ability to like respond straight away, to have the language ready, and that can be the most challenging part of fluency, which is why doing this like deep dive, just immersing yourself within the community where the language is spoken, can be so incredibly helpful, because it forces you to do these things. And the more you do it, the better you become at it. Like my French now is a little bit better than it was 2 years ago. I only go there for like a day every 6 months or so. So I don't get enough French into my system because I'm usually traveling by myself or with other people who don't speak French. So very often you don't get that much of an opportunity to like really have a conversation with people. But yeah, it is, I feel, just because I've been doing it and exposing myself to French and like being in situations where I'm trying to use a little bit of French, that it's becoming easier and easier as I do it. And that's another thing that I want to always give as a tip when it comes to practicing your fluency, is you have to get over that like threshold, and you just need to do it. Like the Nike slogan, just do it. You just have to do it. It's a bit like getting over your fear for public speaking. If that's something you've ever struggled with, it's a similar kind of like mental process that you just need to go through. And the more you do it, the more successful you become at it, and the easier it becomes, the more you'll learn. And it's like this, like things that just accumulates over time. That's another reason why, again, doing the deep dive, traveling to places, or, you know, really interacting with people from the community. If, for instance, you have a local place where people gather who speak the language, you can like see if they're interested in helping you out. It can be a great way to expand your social circle as well. And also to get to know the culture, because language and culture are like this. So that's why going to those places is so incredibly important for your full understanding of a language at any time. But yeah, when it comes to fluency itself, there are things you can do if you don't have those native speakers around you, or if you do not have the ability to travel. It's limited, but there are things you can do. This is a tip I already said in my reading video that I did before. One of the best ways to improve your spoken language is to repeat after people. So if you can watch television series in that language, if you can listen to audiobooks in that language or podcasts, you can very easily like copy paste things. One of the best things is like things like TED Talks, if you try to learn English, because that's my personal background mostly, so that's where most of the tips come from. And English is a language where there's just a lot that you can use. And TED Talks are great because they have the video, so you can hear how things are spoken, how they are being said, but they also have the scripts, like word for word scripts uploaded to their website. So you can take the script and like read it out to yourself, maybe even record yourself to listen to what you're sounding like, and then compare and contrast. You could also do this by turning on subtitles on TV series. You can, like, if it's like the subtitles into target language, you can try and read it out, then listen to how it's spoken, rewind, record yourself doing all that. That can be a great way to really get a feel for the language and how things sound in your mouth without like trying to get to a certain accent. That's not what we're talking about. We're really just talking about getting into a conversation and doing that. But it can make you, because at least I feel that it does, my voice sounds different in English than it does in Dutch. And it always makes me feel very different as well when I speak the language. So getting that feel for yourself and really being able to tell yourself like, okay, this is what I sound like in this language, and getting used to that and getting used to the sounds and sort of like the cadence of things as well. Like language has a rhythm to it, and trying to learn that rhythm I think can be really, really good to try and copy things that have been recorded. It can be like an interview with, you know, one of your favorite artists who speak that language, and that way you can really get a feel for things as well. And if it's like recorded on video, you can slow it down and you can do a lot of things. Like YouTube also has like the subtitle version, and YouTube has a lot of content that has been uploaded in other languages as well. So you can definitely use it as a language learning tool too. But yeah, getting a feel for the language is step one, even without you not even building a single sentence. So yes, that would be my first step if you're just trying to learn a language, to really get a feel for it, is to listen to a lot of it and try to repeat after what you hear, possibly record yourself to get yourself familiar with the sounds of the language. That's step one. Step two, I think, is actually the most important one if you want to become more fluent. And that is to let go of the things you feel you can say in a language that you're better at than the language you're trying to learn. This is the biggest challenge. This is what I've heard people saying so many times within my career. I want to say XYZ in Dutch, and I want to say the same thing in English, and that's why my brain just... Whereas it's okay to take a step back and just go back to the basics. So once you have a grasp of basic grammar and basic vocabulary, in order to become fluent is to try and work those basic sentences into a conversation. There is a clip from Eddie Izzard, It's on YouTube, from one of his shows where he talks about learning French in school and how the only way to work some of the phrases he had learned into a sentence was to go to France with a monkey, a table, and a chair or a cat or whatever it was, because he had a sentence like, the monkey is in the tree, and then I would lose the monkey. You know, it was very, very funny like that, because a lot of the basic sentences you get don't seem to be very useful at first, perhaps, but they can teach you sort of like the basics. So structures that are repeated a lot are incredibly important to just have them like in your back pocket and you can whip them out. And then, of course, a lot of it is building vocabulary as well, knowing the words. But sometimes you can't think of the word that you're trying to say, and it's okay to try and look for another word or to try and explain what it is that you are actually able to say. The most important thing to become more and more fluent as time goes on is to start with the basics and go back to the step that you are familiar with, that you do know very well, to work with that if the step up isn't working for you. This actually has a technical term. It's called circumlocution, where you talk around. Circumlocution is speaking. So speaking around the thing you're actually trying to say, so someone else can say like, oh wait, that's what you mean. But at least you can keep the conversation going within the language you are trying to speak. So that is an incredibly helpful tool. It feels really silly for a lot of people, but especially if you don't know certain words or if you can't really figure it out, very often you can point to things, like especially when I was this is a very good example. I had this just the other day when I was trying to buy those sandals in Germany. I couldn't think of the word shoe size in German. My brain was just not, it wasn't there. So I pointed to like the shoe and oh, Größe. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's the word again. And then it comes back in. So I could, by pointing at the little label on the shoe, like the shoe size on the shoe, she was able to figure out what I meant. And it works like that as well. So circumlocution doesn't have to be you explaining with words. It can be hands, feet, gestures, pointing at things, maybe like pointing at your shirt or whatever it is that's going on. You can very often make yourself understood in other ways. And the reason, I think, and that's my theory, I'm sure there's research into this. I'm not entirely sure. But I feel that that's like the biggest thing that sets people back when it comes to their fluency. You can speak a language. I'm not sure anymore if this was like just a marketing ploy or if it's actually true. But within English, there's only like 2,000 words you really need to know and a couple of basic structures, and you can make do with a lot of like everyday situations. Would you be able to hold a presentation, or would you be able to negotiate a salary? Probably not, but it depends on what kind of level of fluency you're looking for, what is required of you. So you can really think of fluency as like a spectrum. Like it's sort of like maybe in certain areas you are very comfortable and you have all the words and you can say everything, but there may also be a part of the spectrum, especially when you're first starting to learn it, where you can just stick to the basics and stick to what you know, and you can sort of like move along it, but also lose some of it again. So fluency is very much a continuum, something that you can keep stretching. And the way I always explain this to my students, if they ask me questions like this, I always say that learning a language from like a spoken perspective, like language learning in general actually, but especially like being able to speak, it's like going to the gym. It's like working out your muscles. If you've ever been to the gym and you've worked on like a workout routine where you're trying to get stronger, if you're consistent with it and you keep at it, you have no issue working out that muscle and becoming stronger. You get ill for a week and it takes you another 2 months to go back to the old level that you were at. It very often happens that way. And language learning is in a similar vein where, for instance, if you've done that deep dive in the language, and And then maybe a few years down the line, you feel like you're a little less fluent than you used to be. And I have this a lot in like my day-to-day life as well, where some days I really feel like my English is on point and I feel great and everything works really well for me. But there are also days where my English is a little like lacking, where I can't find the words I'm trying to say, where maybe I'm trying to talk about a topic that I haven't talked about before, and that makes it a little bit more challenging to talk about as well. So when it comes to fluency, putting yourself out there and keeping at it and doing it and doing it and doing it. And once you're familiar with one field, you may have to go into another field. And that's how it sort of builds. So you can start with the basics, like asking directions, like all of those things that you've had at school, I'm sure, with like perhaps some other languages you've learned, like really just the basics to be able to move around a city if you happen to be a tourist there, like ordering a meal, saying thank you, like all of your like standard phrases, we call them chunks. Once you have a good amount of chunks that you can use and perhaps also respond to, like if someone gives you a chunk back, you can like talk to them. That's your first step. And then after that, you can see if you can like hang out with someone at a bar and like like there's like all of these different steps, different interactions, whether you can have a conversation, whether you can have that salary negotiation. Those are all things that, you know, as your language level improves, will also, you know, your fluency will hopefully come along. So I think that when it comes to fluency, focusing on the basics is where it's at. And it's the thing that so many people find so difficult because they're like stuck in this, yeah, but in my language, I can say this and I want to say that. I'm like, can you say that thing you're trying to say in one sentence, one very long sentence? Maybe you can chop it up and do it in 3 little ones. And everybody always goes like, that's possible too. And I always say that, I always tell to my students, I would rather have you write or speak correct English that doesn't make you feel lost, that helps you to get your point across, and you can keep doing it in English, than you building the most beautiful sentence and getting stuck halfway through. No, but that's not going to be helpful. So stick to the basics, keep your sentence structure perhaps the same every single time for, you know, just for you to get used to it and to like build the sentence in the same way. Don't worry too much yet at the start of your journey with like politeness and things. I know in a lot of cultures, politeness is incredibly important and there's like different layers to it. English is no different actually, only it's not as explicit in the language sometimes. But when you're learning a language, these nuances and like the cultural aspects of it can be very difficult to grasp at first. So really stick to the basics. It's better to be too formal than too informal. So for instance, for a lot of people who speak, who want to learn Dutch, when I taught those lessons, we would teach them u instead of je. So in Dutch, we do have like 2 very explicit ways of formality in the language. And since it's never going to make you look bad if you're too formal. So teach yourself the most formal way, the most polite way you could possibly be. Like, especially in English, just chuck pleases in there everywhere. Always go for a please. Everybody will be happy. Of course, you can't be rude, but whenever you're trying to learn a language, you're gonna come across moments where you're going to sound a little bit rude because you're not used to the way native speakers might interact. So you're gonna sound rude, you're gonna sound silly, you're gonna mispronounce things, and you're just going to forget words. And that's the beauty of speaking a language, is that you can get really close to sort of how language is spoken to begin with, because those 4 things I just mentioned that everybody's always worried about, everybody does in their native language. Only when it's a native language, nobody bats an eyelid. And then when you do it in your target language, the language you're trying to learn, all of a sudden, all of the mistakes are like this much bigger and everything becomes a big deal. If you record yourself speaking whatever language you feel most comfortable speaking to begin with, just record yourself, like speaking like with a friend at a bar or at a restaurant or on the couch at home. Record yourself for like a good 10 minutes speaking to another person. look at how often you need to stop a sentence because you started it and you get lost halfway through. It happens all the time. How often you need to pause because you cannot think of a certain word. How often you might stumble over something, especially if perhaps you're talking about a subject that is difficult for you to talk about, also in your native language, or maybe because the conversation is just one where you don't really have that much familiarity with the topic to begin with. Those 4 elements are incredibly normal to do in any language. It's just that whenever we start learning another language and we're trying to speak it, we get very hung up with the fact that we have to speak it perfectly. We cannot make mistakes. We have to, but that's the thing, you have to make the mistakes. You have to make the mistakes in order to learn. Learning is a process where we're going to make mistakes. It just happens. You apologize and you move on. And that has led to some very hilarious moments also in my personal language learning journey. I've told you many times before how English is not my native language, how I had to learn it from scratch. This is just something I picked up from school, TV shows, going abroad. I've done all of that. I tend to travel to London once a year, I'm not gonna lie, to keep this up. I read books in English to keep this up. So it's a continuous process, and I also know that even though I teach it and I speak English on a regular basis, if I were to slip somewhere in that system, my English is going to go downhill as well. And it's not going to be as good as it used to be. And I definitely feel my English has changed as well. Not the fluency. Like I've always been pretty fluent in English. Especially because I had to do everything in English the minute I started studying English, because I've been abroad. Those are all things that have really helped me personally as well. But in order to keep up with vocabulary and to be exposed to the language, I still feel I need to do that on a regular basis just to keep it up. And I've had that situation where after a few years of being back in the Netherlands, I felt like my English just wasn't that great. So yeah, I've definitely had that situation where I've just felt like, I'm not feeling that confident right now, or I'm not feeling that comfortable for sure. I make videos that are in English, which is also incredibly helpful. Even if you don't publish them on YouTube or TikTok or whatever place you frequent the most, you could do a video diary of your language learning process. I actually helped someone a while ago, this was years ago, but he had a blog in Dutch because he was American and he wanted to learn Dutch. So I would help him from time to time, leaving comments on his blog, but he kept that blog to be able to write in Dutch as much as possible.